We saw in the census in 2021 that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population had grown 25% since the previous census. The problem with that number is it can't be explained by birth rate alone. The problem with that number, when people start ticking boxes and self-identifying, is that the most vulnerable people end up being the ones that can't even get into the line.
October 14, 2023, Australians defeated a ballot initiative that would have changed the Constitution to enshrine an Indigenous advisory body to the federal parliament. By a margin of 61 to 39, the nation rejected the change pushed by the federal Labor government in this referendum. In South Australia, it was 64 to 35. As a result, a constitutional-based voice, that is an unelected and unaccountable group of Aboriginal Australians that would have given advice to the nation's lawmakers on any matter of its choosing, that has been consigned to history. Now, one key opponent of that voice proposal is our guest today. Kerrynne Liddle is a Liberal senator for South Australia. She was a star performer during the referendum in 2023. Elected in 2022, Senator Liddle was appointed Shadow Minister for Child Protection and the Prevention of Family Violence within a year. She serves on the Joint Standing Committee for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs and has held senior roles across various industries, including tourism, energy, and education. And before Kerrynne entered Parliament in 2022, she's had a long and distinguished career in energy, in resources, and in journalism. Now, after her remarks on economic empowerment in advancing Indigenous communities, Senator Liddle and my colleague Simon Cowan, they will address the key issues related to Indigenous affairs. But for now, please join me in welcoming Senator Liddle to CIS.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's delightful to be here to be able to talk to you about one of the very passionate subjects in my life. I'll give you a little bit of personal context. I was born and raised in Alice Springs. I'm not from the same language group as Senator Nampa Jimpa Price. Despite our respective identities bordering each other, our two groups speak different language. We have different social structures, and Australia is a big place, but we also chase different animals and eat different plants. It is a beautiful country, and I'm delighted to be not just a Liberal senator for South Australia, but also in the Australian Parliament, bringing the skills that I learnt outside of Parliament into debate. I have a bit of what I call an incredibly eclectic career. Sometimes I laugh at it myself. I started life in the pastoral industry, chasing wild cattle through the scrub. And I somehow, after being in rural college, decided that I had an interest in journalism instead. I really didn't know much about news and current affairs, but I was going to have a crack at it. And I look back over the years, and I think it was because I was pretty not afraid of anything, and I was prepared to just have a crack at it. I spent a number of years in mainstream journalism in the years when people were professionally qualified as journalists, and there was people distinguished between those things back then. I spent time at the ABC. I spent time at Channel 7. I spent time in the disaggregated news networks in Queensland at QTV and Sunshine TV. They now no longer exist. And also with the Macquarie News Network. I set up my own business in media and communications and was very successful for about 20 years until I decided to do something different. And that was after being an adult student at university, I did undergraduate studies, postgraduate studies as an MBA, went off and did an ethics fellowship for a year, which was extraordinary. Doesn't mean that the person that does the ethics fellowship is ethical, but what was extraordinary about it was it gave me the opportunity to understand how good people make some pretty terrible decisions, and how that sort of stuff occurs. I also did the Australian Institute of Company Directors diploma and used all of those things to contribute to not-for-profit boards, and to work in companies on major projects in senior leadership roles, such as with Santos when they started the GLNG project. I did some work with Chevron Australia, looking at exploration in the Great Australian Bight. I also worked with Voyagers, which runs Ayers Rock Resort, as their Chief People and Performance Officer. So I have a really reasonable insight about tourism, but I've also spent a fair bit of time in remote communities working on threatened species management and with those things that are important and should be important to all Australians. It is terrific to talk about Indigenous economic development and policy because we've got a lot of work to do. We should be future focused, not looking back, and that's the kind of thing that drives my ideas. All of those experiences I bring into debates on policy. There are a couple of fundamental principles that are important to me. One is that when you treat Indigenous affairs the same way, with the same expectations as you have of everyone else, you draw a line in the sand around low expectations. And I saw that in my first week in Parliament. I remember the first time I was incensed was my first week, when I saw the first piece of legislation I was asked to not vote for was when the Albanese government was looking at aged care in remote communities and had determined that it was acceptable not to have a clinical care expert on the board of those aged care homes in remote communities. And I could not understand how it was possible, given the high rate of chronic illness, that you would not require those boards to have someone with some form of clinical expertise, or at least you were working your way towards that. But that didn't satisfy the Albanese government. They were quite happy to just say, no, they don't need it because they're in a remote community. Well, I say you actually need it even more so because of what happens when you're not in view. The other principle is people can do anything in life. You just need the opportunity. You need good people around you. And you need people who continue to support you when things don't look so good. So that was the principle on which my parents, who raised their children in Alice Springs, there were 5 of us, said, you can do whatever you like. You can go to a public school, but you must go to school. You can have a dream to be anything, but we're going to work out how you're going to do it. Because back in those days, no spring chicken anymore. Alice Springs was a small town, much smaller than it is today. And from that, my parents, my sister has a PhD in environmental science. My other sister she went on to be South Australia's first Indigenous police officer. She was just a police officer, the same as everybody else. She just had a unique context to bring to her work. I became a journalist and obviously in the Australian Parliament today. My little brother was a captain with a major international airline, a training captain, so he trained other pilots for about 25 years and has just recently retired. And my other sister was a teacher. She did teaching. And unfortunately, she passed away many years ago at the hands of a very violent offender. So I'm really passionate about making sure that we are courageous about difficult conversations. When we don't have the courage to question ourselves or to question others, people die. It's that simple. So that's the kind of thing that drives my passion and the passion of my colleagues such as Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who will continue to fight back against the stupid, against the ill-informed, and against policies that ignore the evidence. Look no further than the other time where I was literally gobsmacked when the Northern Territory government, Labor government, lifted the alcohol restrictions in Alice Springs, with the Albanese government standing by, just watching it all happen. They knew what the fallout was going to be because they had a pocket of money to fix the mess after they'd done it. The statistics told us what would happen. The statistics today tell us the evidence of what was going to happen because of that. We saw it too with the removal of the cashless debit card. The statistics give us the evidence. Those people are so far behind where they could have been. Those children are not in school in those communities. There are some communities in outback South Australia where 3% of children go to school 90% of the time. There are schools in the Northern Territory, many of them in remote communities, where children are at school 24% of the time. Now, I don't buy, this is all cultural. And the reason I don't buy that is, in the generations before, I can tell you women that are a little bit older than me in those communities can read and write better than I can. My staff will tell you that. My handwriting is terrible, but their handwriting is perfect, and they went to work. When I was working at Voyages, I remember taking the security guard one day out to the community, and the first thing I said to him was, look at those beds that are out there in the bush, lying on those old cyclone beds. Have you noticed that they've got perfect pin tucks? He was shocked. And I said to him, that's because those people in that generation worked in those hotels. They worked in the pastoral industries. They worked in the mining industries. They worked damn hard. Sure, you can argue that some of them didn't get the wages that they should have or the conditions that were equal to others, but they were proud to work. They worked and they were looking to the future because they believed this was a country that could deliver a better future. What's the fundamental element that's landed right in the middle of that? Well, it's welfare and it's paternalistic thinking. There is nothing worse for people, regardless of who you are, where you come from, than low expectations, because that's what will be delivered. When I was at Voyages, we were given a target of we want to have 400 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees working there. And when I got there, I thought, okay, well, we've got a reasonable number coming through, not that number, but they're coming through and they're going straight out again. And we're loading people onto planes as fast as they're coming in. So I said, well, we've got to do something on day one. I contacted the medical service and said, I want you to come and help me on day one, do close the gap medical checks on people. And I want you to give me a clinical psychologist to help those people that need that additional help. Because I already knew I had structure. People who were rostered on got a meal. They had their own accommodation. And in no time at all, with those things in place, including my ability to control access to alcohol through the control of the liquor license, we turned that retention rate around. We kept people were happier. And by the time I'd left, I was there for 18 months, but when I started, there was one person employed from the local community of Mutijulu. By the time I'd left, there was 18, and 2 of those were managing the hotels. High expectations, putting the tools in place that people need to be successful, and responding in measure when people need help, not treating everybody the same. I turn now to economic policy. It's an area I've been on the board of Indigenous Business Australia, increasing home loans for Indigenous peoples. And I can see from that some of the amazing things that you can do when you provide the right assistance. The default rate of people who have an IBA home loan is much, much lower than the general population. It's not that they're treated really any differently. It's just that there's a bit of work done with people to understand what are the responsibilities, how do you plan to manage your mortgage. And when things get tough, there's somebody they can reach out to talk to. Aboriginal home ownership is increasing significantly, and that's a good thing. Not everybody requires social housing. So one of the principles that I talk about a lot is making sure that the most vulnerable people are the first in line. We saw in the census in 2021 that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population had grown 25% since the previous census. The problem with that number is it can't be explained by birth rate alone. The problem with that number, when people start ticking boxes and self-identifying, is that the most vulnerable people end up being the ones that can't even get into the line. It skews the data about how well we're doing. I mean, we've just had the Close the Gap report that came out last week, and that actually tells us that there hasn't been much change, although when you read this year's Close the Gap report, it's 10% smaller than the last one, and I can't really tell how you compare the data. Right? The Prime Minister in his speech said, well, you know what, we haven't got any more of the targets meeting the targets, but he didn't either tell us, and I can't work out, how many targets have moved by how much. So when you look at things like the removal of the cashless debit card, the lifting of those alcohol restrictions, the cost of living crisis that many Australians are facing, of course, Close the Gap was going to go in the wrong direction. There was no other way for it to go. So I didn't need to wait for the report to come out. I've written the speech beforehand because I knew exactly what was going to happen to that indicator. I refer now to one of the big things that we are talking about as a coalition, and that is the audits that we keep talking about. We've seen countless examples of where organisations really need to have someone who's accountable for performance early. There is no benefit, just like there is in a cost of living crisis, when businesses are lost to our ecosystem. It takes away choice. The same in Aboriginal communities where services are lost because they've become dysfunctional. It is the people that rely on those services that we should be thinking about first and foremost, not satisfying the amplified demands of the leadership within those organisations. So it is we see in multi-million-dollar organisations that are funded by the Commonwealth and sometimes by the state, boards where not a single person on that board actually has any skills in accounting, in the core area of focus of that board, in law, in stakeholder engagement. I don't mind if there are people on there that aren't as lucky as I am to have an education in that area. But you can't pretend and put everyone who signs with an X off on financial statements on a board and expect you're going to have fiscal responsibility. What you have is CEOs that control everything, including how many meetings you have, including who gets paid at those meetings. Very powerful people. So we do have to intervene. We do have to improve the way we do things. And we do have to apply the same standards to those boards and organisations as we should expect of everything else and everyone else. You know, I just want to talk a little bit about my time in the oil and gas industry because it was interesting during the Voice campaign. You know, I remember going to Parliament House when the mining industry was right behind some of these companies were right behind the Voice. And I was walking along talking to each of those stands saying, what on earth are you doing? Why would you come out publicly and support this proposition? And the answer I got from a couple of them was, because our traditional owners want us to support it. And I can understand that from a company that has a very small footprint, but I could not understand it from these big companies with a significantly large footprint. There were many reasons why people in the quiet of a ballot box and the privacy of a ballot box voted no. Some people just were convinced by the argument about diversity. Some were convinced that it wasn't the tool that was going to make a difference to their lives. Some were just downright offended because they believed that they hadn't been properly engaged in that process and had been taken over by people on the East Coast and a few people in other places. There were issues. I remember sitting in one of the committees because I was on a committee appointed to look at the implication of the words, not the yes or no argument, but what's the impact of the words likely to be in this country. And of course, there's probably lawyers in the room. Lawyers' jobs are to not agree with the other lawyer, right? And so that's what we saw playing out in this. There were lots of different positions on the risk of the words to the Constitution. They couldn't even agree themselves. We even saw people checking off on their own homework. So for me, I was convinced categorically that this was not going to be the answer, that this was not going to be good for this country. And I can tell you as an Indigenous Australian, it has been terrible for Aboriginal people themselves. People talk about it being divisive. Well, it has been divisive in Aboriginal communities too, and destructive. And that's on the Prime Minister, in my view. He picked the time, he picked the process, and he led that from a position of being in government. My portfolio responsibilities are in domestic and family violence and child protection, and also in Indigenous, more recently, I think about 4 weeks ago, in the Indigenous health portfolio that Peter Dutton had decided was no longer going to be an assistant ministry, it would be a ministry in its own right. I'm privileged to have those positions because I think if you don't get those things right, people can't participate. If you don't get things like drug and alcohol misuse sorted, people can't participate effectively. If parents aren't getting their children to school for whatever reason, children can't participate because they can't read and write. They don't understand standards of behaviour in public places, in the workplace. It is really that simple for people that have worked in these areas that if you can't read a danger sign, if you can't read the precaution notices, if you have so little regard for others around you, how on earth can you work in a workplace where they are critical elements of a company operating in the mining sector, in the construction sector, in the pastoral industry, in the tourism industry, even in here, making sure that there's no trip hazards that are around for people. So we do have to do work with children. We do have to do work with parents. We do have to do work to make sure that those perpetrators, if you look at the Northern Territory, and the Northern Territory curiously has some of the best stats on which to work, the number of people who are in custody in the Northern Territory who are there for domestic violence-related offences is catastrophic. It's way up there. I think it's something like nearly 80% or might even be higher than that. So we actually do have to address and have uncomfortable conversations in order to improve people's lives. But we have to do it in a way that removes this veil of paternalism that just sits over some of the Aboriginal policy that we see today. And some of it is extraordinary. I sit there scratching my head going, how is it even reasonable that people have come up with this as a reasonable idea? Let me give you an example of that comment I talked about before about same standards. In Central Australia, in response to the lifting of those alcohol restrictions, the government put $300 million into a town of 27,000 people. It's a lot of money. That same town, that same year, had a hospitalisation rate of 66,000 people. Immediately after those alcohol restrictions were lifted, the DV incident rate rose 77%. So you can understand what happens to people when you blindly go ahead and introduce policy that you're prepared to put 300 million behind because you know the impact will be catastrophic. In Alice Springs now, there are less businesses than there were 3 years ago. It's still a beautiful town. It's still wonderful to visit, and I still love it and the people. But they should never have been exposed to that kind of policy because it has affected everyone and the impact has been generational. All of a sudden you have a group of children who've been exposed to additional trauma, additional impact of alcohol and drug misuse. They're not going to school, and yet one of the responses is to provide a bus service that ferries those children home when they're wandering the streets. But get this, the bus service runs until 4 a.m. in the morning. I put it to you, how happy would you be if your 10-year-old is running around the streets with a group of mates at 4 a.m. in the morning and the taxpayer is picking up the bill to drop them off home to a house that's probably not even safe? So we have to actually have those conversations about what is a responsible person when the police drop them off home? What is a reasonable time for buses to be dropping children off at home? Because they're not going to go to school if they're sitting up until 4 o'clock in the morning walking around the streets. It's the same in Katherine. So we have policies at the moment where quite simply the idea is not bad, but you need to apply the same principles to those policies and those programs as you do every other child, because the foundation principle for all of us should be do no further harm. And I've given you some examples of where I think we've completely failed in that respect. We harmed Australia when we went to this referendum. We harmed Australia with the lifting of those alcohol restrictions because everyone is impacted by that in a cost of living crisis. We harmed Kalgoorlie, Ceduna, the East Kimberley, when we lifted the cashless debit card and ended that without even a social impact assessment, without even a proper transition plan, with a business model that said, you know what, we know we're going to make a mess. This is the amount of money you've got to fix it up. How do you want to spend it? Well, that's not a plan. And that's why our plan is to focus on those organisations that are not performing well. Our plan is practical strategies. And I can tell you it is applying the same principles that we would every other child and providing the help that is needed on the basis of need, not on the basis of how you identify. So hopefully that gives you some indication of who I am and how I approach things. I'm very happy to take some questions if that.
Thank you very much, Senator Liddle. And now I'd like to call on my colleague, Simon Cowan, who will have an exchange with the Senator before he takes questions from all of you. So please think of some tough questions for the Senator. Over to you, Simon.
Senator, let's start with the audits. So one of the things that you hear from a lot of people on both sides of the fence in Indigenous politics is that there's a lot of incompetence and an enormous amount of corruption. The amount of money that's going into these communities, you've identified some yourself in your speech, but the amount of money that's going in here and how it's being dealt with, there's a whole bunch of rules that could be improved as well, but there's also a lot of wrongdoing. There's an enormous reluctance from within the public service in particular to do anything about this for fear of being called racist. How are you actually going to implement these audits and make this change?
Well, I think the first thing you do is say what I said before, which is I'm not interested in somebody turning this into a debate about race. I'm interested in turning this into a conversation about performance and about the people that matter most. So for me, I'll give you an example. When I went to a remote community, went into the store, had a look at the products that were on the shelves. a bottle of Coke at 2 litres is the same price in that store, a remote store, as it is in the nearest town of Alice Springs. Non-perishable goods like Band-Aids, like sanitary items, like antiseptic. Whoa, the difference in the prices for non-perishable items. It is outrageous. When you talk to people, a lot of people try and make this a lot more complicated than it needs to be, and bureaucrats are very good at that. Their jobs and the industry relies on this. For me, it's really simple. If you can't afford a Band-Aid because the Band-Aids cost $7 for home brand Band-Aids, right, as opposed to $2 in the other shop, and you've got a cut and that cut gets worse, it gets infected, you have to then go to the health service. The health service says, that child's cut is pretty ugly, you're going to have to go to Alice Springs. Then you start getting child protection involved. Then you start getting a whole lot of services involved that probably didn't need to be involved if the Band-Aids were just a reasonable price. And in the last 2 weeks, we've seen the government come out and say, well, to fix the food security, we're going to keep 30 items at the same price. I'm interested to see whether they're talking about non-perishables. And we're going to give some money to the stores to actually run their refrigerators. The problem I have with that is it's good that they're investing some money in those stores, but on those same stores are directors who can't read and write. 3 of those stores in South Australia were just fined by the regulator $24,000 plus the legal fees for not reporting on their obligations. Well, who's going to pay for that? In the end, it's going to, again, be the consumer, the people that rely on that shop for their goods. So you've got the government saying, well, we're just going to pour more money in, rather than talking about the accountability and the governance of those very stores. There's not a person on those boards that has experience in retail, in accounting, in legal issues, and there should be. That's where you start to improve the performance of the CEO. That's when you start to have a view over what's actually happening and what services they're delivering to the most vulnerable people. So you can make it really hard and difficult. And yes, we do have to tackle some of the influence of those land councils because, quite frankly, I think there are enough examples of needing to have a closer look at what they've been doing. But it's across the board, across every sector. And so nobody should be immune from this. But just thinking the problem is going to be solved by giving money to a store when people are paying for electricity in those areas, and the electricity goes off regularly, so their food soils, and then they have to, in the same week, it goes off twice, and then they have to go and buy all their goods again. You have to be real about what's actually happening in those communities to be able to understand what you need to do.
How have we got to the point, though, where we need the federal government to intervene to lower the price of Band-Aids in a community? Is this, and there's sort of 2 competing narratives here, I think. One is historical racism, the communities have always been poor. This is just the latest manifestation of 250 years of colonial oppression. The other vision of this is, and I think this is sort of what you and Warren and Jacinta have been talking about, actually the communities functioned okay. There were a bunch of problems that needed to be fixed, but the way that the government's tried to solve these problems is this avalanche of money. And that's created a whole bunch of different problems that can't be solved with another avalanche of money. Which of those narratives is correct, do you think?
Well, as I said to David Spears in that interview, I've never been to a house where people don't have a sink or a working toilet, or that house has been even maintained to a reasonable standard, and they've said, can you come and fix colonisation? Can you do something about, settlement of this country? You do have to, I think we can understand better our history, but a focus of some on just grievance is not helpful to those people. And that's why we will continue to ask about those issues of governance that impacts those people every day. So I think that's the key, and I will continue to say, for those people, there is no benefit in continuing to look back at issues that are so far removed from the day-to-day reality for them, which is their safety, which is their living standards, which is high expectations, and that includes of work. While this government has been putting in place its Real Jobs program, and I'm looking forward to see what that really looks like. I say a real job is created in the private sector, where people go to work, they're around the water cooler, they have conversations, the same qualifications, the same experience, the same opportunity as everyone else. That's where real jobs are created, and that's where Indigenous Australians are flourishing, not in government employment programs that are set for life, where there are difficulties in maintaining high standards.
A sort of related issue to that that's come up, particularly, I'm thinking in America, is around this issue of affirmative action. And I think it's become a very significant political point. In America, you saw the Supreme Court decisions that basically chastised the universities for promoting this sort of affirmative action policies in admissions. To what extent do you think that, one, affirmative action is an issue for Indigenous Australians in perpetuating particularly the gap between Indigenous people who live in cities and towns and Indigenous people who live in remote communities? So to what extent is affirmative action an issue here, and to what extent is it perpetuating some of the gaps that perhaps are less reported on?
Well, I think in the very early stages of my life, I took up an opportunity to work with the ABC, and that was part of not just an affirmative action for Aboriginal people, but I also had a background in the rural area, so they were particularly keen on my employment. But there's a point at which you say, actually, I just need the best person for the job. I would prefer. And I have all my life, as I said in my maiden speech. When I was a journalist, I was just a journalist. And in fact, even as an Aboriginal journalist, I found myself interviewing National Action, which was a white supremacist group that was around and prominent some 30 years ago. The approach for me and for my workplace and for my colleagues was, you do the same as everyone else. And I like that, because expectations were exactly the same for me as they were for everyone else. And I think, we do ourselves a disservice when we have, and I gave you an example, I was just a journalist. I just happened to come with a perspective that could inform Indigenous affairs writing, but even my news directors were not brave enough to send me out to all the Indigenous stories, because they would have heard from me about that. I go back to my brother. He was not an Indigenous pilot. He was a pilot who could fly a plane and had been trained appropriately to do so. All of those other examples that I gave are important, because, they were just people doing their jobs and wanted to be treated the same as everyone else, and the same expectations of the qualifications that enabled them to take up those positions. That's the critical aspect. Do I think we need an Indigenous ambassador? No. What I think we need is people who understand about products that might be able to be traded that are authentic Indigenous products. Do I think Indigenous doctors should only practice in Indigenous organisations? Absolutely not. They should be qualified and are qualified to treat anyone, and that's what we should expect.
Terrific. Just one more from me, and then please raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question. We'll have a roving mic. I guess I'm going to say that this is a positive note, because I think a lot of what we've talked about so far has been quite negative, but it's going to start with a very negative statistic. Some of the research that we've done here looked at and compared remote Indigenous communities of varying sizes with equally remote communities, equally sized remote communities, but were not majority Indigenous. And what we found is, in terms of the number of businesses, it was 100 businesses in the non-Indigenous community to 1 in the Indigenous community. That you'd see an Indigenous community with say 10,000 people in it, that it'd have less than 10 businesses in total for the entire community, whereas an equivalent alternative community might have 100, 200, 300 businesses. Tell me, do you think it's possible for us to fix that problem, to bring those communities to the standard? You know, the issue can't be remoteness because these are similarly remote communities. Can we bring those communities more in line? Is there a possibility to fix this problem?
Well, if I look in my own state of South Australia, the number of organisations that and programs that were created when the cashless debit card was removed, there are already a number of programs in there. There are significant levels of duplication. There are significant levels of silo type behaviour where people are too busy focusing on their own fiefdoms than they are on delivering to the people they exist to serve. And I think we have a problem with bureaucrats and sometimes parliamentarians that aren't prepared to be courageous and say, well, actually, no, you're not performing. These are the metrics we expect. You haven't met them. You're not going to meet them based on your history. We're going to give the service delivery to someone else. We've got a town in Ceduna of 3,000 people in the whole district. We're not talking about Indigenous people. Most of the Indigenous people in that town actually work. But we do have a proliferation of services that are delivering to the people in that community, and we're not seeing a lot of improvement in the data. So it takes people to be courageous about calling out poor performance, but also being prepared to do something about it.
Terrific. So open the floor to questions now.
I don't see a problem with the bus service. I would make it 24/7. Also, there should be a truant officer. You have to have enforcement or else people will not go to school. And there's got to be a database that measures every Aborigine student as to whether he's qualified or not. And it's then got to come from what we call free choice in a democratic society. If they want to sink, let them sink. If they want to swim, let them swim.
Thank you very much for that. Just to pick up on that point, I know that one of the things that we did as part of our work in the education team was look at the success stories, to the extent there are any, of remote Indigenous schools. We found enormous hurdles in getting to the starting point of finding the data, because a lot of what's there, the data that this gentleman was talking to about, attendance, that information's being hidden or deliberately not being captured to avoid reporting on those negative stories about no one attending school and people graduating without being able to read and write.
Well, it's a bit like the information we're trying to get about the free TAFE, right? We hear a lot about enrolments, but we can't get anything about completions or attendance. So the same applies to those schools where the Northern Territory again has the best data, where every semester they actually record attendance, average attendance. I still have questions about whether that's actually accurate data, because the schools themselves are funded on the basis of the number of children that are enrolled. And so therefore, it's a bit like when we headed into Alice Springs a couple of times and they knew that we were coming in. There was a bit of a whip around in there and in Ceduna to clean the joint up and make sure, that a lot of what was normal on the streets wasn't happening. And we see that in those schools where there's a whip around getting all the kids to school for that day, and then there's pretty low expectations of that continuing the next day. That's the reality, and I say that not from a position of thinking that might be happening. I know it's happening.
Yeah, and you see the reverse on NAPLAN Day. The students who might fail are told to stay home, right? Peter?
Yes. When I started university, my first vacation job was actually digging drains for the Mint. And I had a very excellent boss at the time, and he was an Aboriginal from Sydney. My more recent encounter was in the Kimberleys, when I was told I shouldn't leave the grounds of the motel, which had electrified fence around it because it was too dangerous. What I learned from this is that there's really very little prospect of raising the standards of Aborigines unless we can bring about much greater integration. That means basically stopping subsidies to these isolated areas and encouraging Aborigines to do as my first boss did, which was go to Sydney and become a very productive member of society. Everything else seems to be largely irrelevant because we just can't, it's just so entrenched, what you've been talking about, the lack of education, all these other things, that integration, which seems to be so unpalatable to many people, is the only solution.
Yeah, no.
Can I just say one of the challenges here is in all of those places, a place like Alice Springs. When I was there a couple of weeks ago, I was saying to somebody who, people are very honest about it when you pull them aside. How many kids are we actually talking about? We're talking about 40 children that are running muck in Alice Springs. Most children that come from remote communities are law-abiding and cared for and loved by their parents. There is a cohort that is experiencing life that we can't imagine. And they are the hardest for us to reach. We need the very best people around those children, not the last person in line who'll take up a job. We need high expectations of those people delivering those jobs. And we need people who are prepared to do what it takes to reach those people, but remain with the principle of high expectations. So we're not talking about a large number. We're talking about a small number. You gave an example of a high fence. One of the best examples I've ever seen is in Alice Springs, there's a women's shelter. They used to have a high mesh fence, 3 stories high. Well, because now those women go there for safety. 99% of the women that are in there are Indigenous. That fence now is a 10-metre high brick fence because the men kept climbing the fence. Now, the first thing that came to my mind was, what, you need to build a higher fence to keep these men out? No, you need to be really clear about your standards and expectations of if those women are fleeing them because they're violent offenders, then it's not okay for you to even think that you can climb that fence. So we're kind of almost dumbing down the rules to meet our expectations of the people that, are perpetrators.
And just sort of further to Peter's point, are the incentives wrong here? Are we in fact incentivizing people to stay in remote communities that probably aren't economically viable because of, say, for example, the rules under the Land Rights Act?
Well, the contradiction to some of that, and that is you look at a place like Mutijulu, which is at the foot of Uluru, right? People pay to go into the national park. There are royalties distributed by the land councils from the national park. Some communities have mines right next to them, so there are jobs there. Some communities have royalties that flow from those operations. There are certainly jobs for people of Mutijulu and surrounding areas in Yalara. But sometimes it's easier just to pick up welfare, right? Rather than having a job. Rather than having high expectations that you will take up that job rather than take up welfare. So we have a fundamental problem in welfare or work. And we kind of need to address it keep it simple, address it from that perspective. Because in a lot of those communities, there are jobs. They're just not taken up by the people from those communities.
Terrific. We'll go here and then over to Simon Heffer.
It seems to me from what you said, there is something like a very serious, urgent problem with children who are not educated. And is there a need for some kind of very strong solution of this that is very well promoted? I'm thinking in a very different context, for example, of the GI plan that the Americans introduced after the war. Is there a set of issues that can be brought together, or a set of solutions that can be brought together that deal with education, which deal with the attitudes of the parents towards their children's responsibilities and the opportunities for work? together? Is there some way to do that, or is it going to be small piece by small piece by small piece?
Well, I'm hearing more and more about this. There seems to be a proliferation of ideas about boot camps for kids that are finding themselves in trouble. But as I said, when you actually peel it back, we're only talking about a very small number of children. I for the life of me, can't understand. People know who those children are. They even know the language group those children are from. What we need to do is be prepared to put things in place to help those families navigate a better solution, because they can't do it themselves anymore. That's gone, right? So you need rehab facilities that actually respond or require. There's actually this ridiculous situation in Central Australia, and I've been asking even the Law Council, everybody I go to, so if anybody's got a solution here, there is a DV program in Central Australia for people who can actually get consideration of their sentencing once they're sentenced, if they participate in it. The problem is their lawyers say you can't be participating in that behaviour change program because it might go to an admission of guilt. So those people are likely at some stage in their lives to have been perpetrators, victim survivors, and witnesses of violence. So I say, just do it. It's such a significant issue. Just do it. But the legal system works against them doing it because they're concerned about the implications in sentencing if they participate. So this is the ridiculousness of what are some of the challenges. So I'm trying to work out, how do we actually work through this with some pretty clever minds? What about the poor person that's actually there trying to navigate their way to a better life? They're not going to even be able to begin to understand how to do that when they're being told by an advisor, don't do it. But I also have a problem with there's a proliferation of behaviour change programs that essentially haven't been evaluated, continue to be funded, and in my view should be shut down, and give the money to those programs that do all the right things and also have a clinical trauma-informed response attached to it that is about the kind of behaviour that we're talking about, not sitting around a campfire talking about just culture, and that's a behaviour change program. That's not good enough.
Well, 10 years ago, we looked into a number of federal Indigenous programs. I think we found there were 1,100, and we found about 50 had ever been evaluated. And of those, less than a third had actually been evaluated effectively. Most of them had just had the participants say, did you enjoy receiving your free money from the government? To which they ticked the box, yes. Program was successful. It was evaluated.
Well, let me give you a very recent example. So we waited for the Albanese Labor government to do the evaluation of the cashless debit card, right? So they got the University of Adelaide to do the evaluation. In there, they did, one of the things that they said was we couldn't find a causal effect, right? But you ask a local, they'll tell you when things just went off the rails for them, right? So that's a pretty good indicator. They also asked stakeholders, they also asked people who were on the card. There were people who were really honest. All of them were honest and said, well, you know what? I'm having a great time now. I don't spend any of my money on food. My kids don't have any food. But that's all right because they go to the service that actually provides for lunches for them, and, they get picked up by the bus, and, I don't have to worry about that. But I'm drinking myself to death now. People were really honest. It was actually enlightening reading. What happened was the government got up there and said, well, it also says that there were some positive benefits. But what it also said was they were mostly negative, right? The South Australian government did not provide any information about hospitalisation rates, about increasing consumption of alcohol in that town, and they know what it is because there's only one bottle shop, right? Increasing levels of gambling in that town, increasing numbers of children who were now in the child protection system. They provided not a skerrick of data to inform that important evaluation, and they did not hear from a single voice from a child. That should be completely unacceptable to everyone. So they can't hide behind there's no causal effect because they were irresponsible and ruthless in not providing the evidence that would have confirmed what every local knows. It happened and it got much worse. It was catastrophic when they removed the cashless debit card.
Take a couple more questions. We'll go for Simon in the back and then here to Peter.
Thank you, Simon. Senator, you talked about the considerable achievements of your own family, from which I've drawn the conclusion that there's equality of opportunity in Australia. You've also talked extensively, as have others, about the damaging effect of the welfare state and poor parenting. And that seems to me to be a main obstacle to equality of opportunity asserting itself. Your party could be in power in 2 or 3 months' time. What would you hope your party would do to accelerate equality of opportunity and, more to the point, accelerate the ability of people to take it up in the years to come?
I think I would remove the ability just to get welfare, which is supposed to be a hand up, not a handout, and expect that wasn't a destination of itself. There are people who maybe could not, because of cognitive impairment, for a whole range of reasons, front up to a job every day, every single day, but they can do something to contribute, and it's important that they do. So I think the key here is to making sure that people have access to having the best life that they can possibly have. Not everybody is going to be able to, fly a plane, manage a big company, or be in a senior leadership position. But you know what my dad used to always say? He's very wise. He used to say, be nice to the person that mops the floor, because they can make you slip on your ass and look pretty stupid anytime they feel like it, right? So it's about recognizing that no matter what somebody is doing, this is the messaging I get from that, they are making a contribution. But this idea that we have now, where there is absolutely no responsibility to contribute other than to exist until you die, is just not the way forward for people. And that starts in the schools. It starts with people not accepting when they're born or when they're in a hospital delivering a baby that your lot in life is to be bashed into every single day, if that is your circumstance. And it's incumbent on us to recognise too that not every Aboriginal person experiences being bashed every single day. So we have to treat people on the basis of need. We have to respond to that need, and we have to make sure that we give the resources that navigate to that need, not just going, well, you're Indigenous, so you must need all of this stuff, because that's just simply not true.
Trudy. Peter, and then we'll go to the back, and then we'll come over here for the last question.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks for being here. Just taking this the next step, if you are in government, do you think there is a possibility of a return to some of those systems like the cashless debit card that have proven to be more effective than everything we've had since? Can you do it?
Well, see, this is the interesting thing. The cashless debit card was only trialled in communities that wanted it. The decision to remove it came out of other places, not out of those communities themselves. So fundamentally, the lie that was promoted everywhere else completely ignored the fact that the card was introduced only in those communities that wanted it. And let's make no mistake, income management still exists. When the government made a big deal about we're going to remove the cashless debit card, there is still income management in the Northern Territory, right? They are intending to remove it, even though they won't say that publicly. We know they're intending to remove it because they did a Senate committee, a joint House committee hearing where the recommendation was to end income management. They've already started the consultations, the Department of Social Services in the Northern Territory, about the card's removal. So there is no doubt in my mind that they are intending to remove income management. In the Northern Territory, 1 in 5 people is on income management. It's an extraordinary number, right? So you got to go, what is going to happen in the Northern Territory when that happens? Because if you get a car and you insure your car in the Northern Territory at the moment, the same car, I did this exercise a couple of weeks ago. I compared Alice Springs, the same car, Kalgoorlie, Townsville, and Port Lincoln. And to insure your car in Alice Springs costs $800 more. And that's not because of its location or its demographics. That's because of what locals have to endure in the Northern Territory post the lifting of those alcohol restrictions. Can we bring the cashless debit card back? I speak to people all the time, even Aboriginal people, who say, do you know what? I wasn't so sure about this card, but I'm damn sure about it now, because they are living it, they are seeing it. And you know what? The narrative was it's just taking away people's rights. But the reality is those communities said they wanted it. That's why they were trialled there. You could actually spend, depending on what the community negotiated as the proportion that was quarantined, if it was 80-20, you could spend 20% of your money that came from welfare on grog. You could do that, no problem. What you couldn't spend was the whole 80%. So people did have, if I went around the table now, even with people in this room, I bet you wouldn't all have, cash, the equivalent of what you got in your bank account, in your wallets. So the argument was people needed cash. This was restrictive. Sure, you need some cash if you're particularly in remote regional and rural areas, but you don't need it all in cash.
Terrific. We'll go up here.
Senator, thank you very much for your words today. It's so refreshing to hear from people with the experience of life and being able to tell us how it happens on the ground. Along the lines of the same question, really enjoy what your solutions are, and I want to, not can you just do it, but can you overcome the bureaucrats, if you like, and what's the difficulty in a first-term government to get the action happening on the ground so that we can see that there is change and not wonder?
I think for me, my strength is I've come from an environment of high performance and cause and effect. So if somebody's telling me that everything's okay, we're doing this, I'm not going to be satisfied. Show me how it's happening, and I'll go and look at it myself. So, I went into the store. I know what the prices are. I go out to those communities. I know who's providing good service. I know which kids are in school and which kids aren't. You've got to actually go right down those burrows to see the evidence and follow the evidence. That's what's really important, because, change makes everyone uncomfortable. Our job is to manage that change. And for a while, making sure people are pretty uncomfortable with that change.
So a Department of Government Efficiency and straight into, like Elon Musk, the Indigenous Public Service?
Yes, absolutely. There's lots of things I think we can do to improve across the whole of government, not just in this area. But there are critical, really obvious things that I would love to get started on right now to see change actually happen.
Terrific. And I know we've kept you longer than we promised, but the questions have been fantastic. So we're going to end with just one from this lady over here.
Thank you. Thanks, Kerrynne. That was wonderful. I wanted to ask, and I'm very glad, thank you very much for mentioning about the divisiveness amongst Aboriginal people that the referendum fomented. I wanted to ask about how much groupthink do you think factors into that. I'll give an example. The New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, for example, made a blanket statement just before similar to the mining companies. This is a New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. I'd like to acknowledge Sean Gordon as well, who was also, it was a yes. So, we can have those disagreements, but the division, the divisiveness, and I'm wondering how much groupthink do you think really factored into that, and can we do, what can we do about that?
I think that's a good point, and not just about how much groupthink, but has any of that groupthink changed?
Well, certainly I see a lot more people coming forward and saying, well, actually, I voted no, but I'm not going to tell anyone, which is a really sad state of affairs. I think people who voted yes voted because they saw that as a way forward. Maybe it's because I come from a slightly different perspective, different experiences, which is fine. And so, you look, even before entering Parliament, I was convinced it wasn't the right thing. The things I learnt along the way in participating in the committee that actually looked at the potential impact on the words in the Constitution, the conversations I had with a whole range of people confirmed for me it was an absolute no. So it was kind of easy for me to have really authentic conversations about why I was a no. I have to say, I don't think we're in a better place because of that referendum. None of us is in a better place. I don't think people will give up on and saying, we need a voice. We keep hearing now that, the narrative now is the number of people that actually voted yes. So they'll keep moving ahead despite what Australia said. I hope we don't see another referendum like that in my entire lifetime or in the lifetime of my children who are not yet born. And I think the way we actually create better outcomes is to create opportunity for everyone, and again, go back to high expectations. Can I just, your question about groupthink, I know that in business and in university, groupthink is a really dangerous thing. It's a really bad thing. And what happened in that debate was people demonised people who had an alternate view. And that's never a good thing for anyone. So I think, there were some of us that behaved really respectfully, and I have some very dear friends who were clearly in the position of yes, and they're, they held that position right to the very end. I think when you look at life and you look at everything, groupthink is a bad thing. And I think when we're talking about diversity, what we should be talking about is diversity of people who are in those conversations, because unfortunately what we see in Indigenous affairs is the very same people over decades and decades leading and in those conversations, and right next to them are people that have learnt from those people rather than people from outside. There is a whole lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have nothing to do with that group that runs those organisations. They're just off creating their own lives. But where they're not in those conversations about how to get change. And I think one of the fundamental errors of what we do in this policy space is not asking those people who have been very successful in creating their own futures how they got to where they are. What were the hurdles that they overcame? What did they need in place? We don't ask them. We just keep going back to the same people all the time in that space. We should be asking those people over there to participate in finding the solutions, but we don't do it.
Thanks very much for that, and I'll pass over to Tom to wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, Senator, and thanks to all of you for your excellent questions. That was terrific. We covered a wide range of issues. And as we've discussed, this discussion today goes against the backdrop of the Voice referendum from October 2023. And if we can take solace in that referendum, it is that it was, I think, a belated recognition of the top-down approach to Indigenous affairs that has been part and parcel of Canberra policy towards disadvantaged communities for the last half century. I think it's been a recognition that that top-down approach of Indigenous affairs has not worked for thousands of Aboriginal people in remote communities. The problems are difficult, but they're not intractable. And one thing is clear, the Voice and what it represented was not the way to achieve bottom-up solutions to the problems that roil remote communities. Many solutions rooted in the ideas of liberalism, and this is what we at CIS stand for, have provided paths for people from across the globe to develop attitudes, habits, and skills that facilitate upward mobility. And we at CIS will continue hard in the coming months and years to achieve those outcomes. And so we are very grateful today that Senator Liddle could be back at CIS. Senator Liddle spoke at our annual concilium on the Gold Coast last October. Welcome back, Senator. We're very grateful you could be here today to address the way forward for Indigenous policy. Please join me in thanking Senator Liddle. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound Liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical Liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.